I've been running parts for a specialty tool distributor out of Albuquerque for a few years now, mostly long hauls on I-40 that start at sunset and end a few hours after dawn March 3rd, 2024. A Sunday looked like every other overnight loop. Pick up a crate of diesel injectors, drop them in Amarillo, swing back with some returns, and be home in time for a late break fast. I drank too much convenience to store coffee on the westbound leg, so about 2 a.m. Started scanning the empty desert for a place to stop just inside Quay County alone. The Texaco sign glowed like Erdstar 100 yards off the frontage road. The station's at by itself. No motel, no houses, just high desert scrub and the hume of distant highway traffic. One pickup idled at the far pump with nobody inside the main building. Cinder block painted a tired tan, flickering fluorescent above the door, and a handle-lettered open sign inside the place smelled like old Freer oil and floor cleaner. A radio mumbled classic rock over a single ceiling. Speaker. The clerk stood behind bulletproof glass, gray-beard trucker cap, the kind of face you expect this far from anywhere. I paid for gas, grabbed a gator, then leaned close to the slot beneath the window, got our room key. He didn't look up from his receipt book. Bathrooms out of order. Manhiston was flat as if he'd rehearsed it 100 times. Nobody uses it at night. And nodded toward the hallway. The pipe burst last month. The company won't fix it. Sorry, is that okay? Butas. It turned something nagged at me down that hallway. The metal door marked restroom was clearly lit underneath a warm line on the floor tile. If the plumbing was shot, why bother leaving the light in a filled the van, still debating whether to drive another 40 mito. To Kumara Detergency. One. He walked back inside and headed for the restroom without asking. The clerk's eyes followed me. In the convex mirror, the door was locked, a hand written out of order note angled from a strip of masking tape. It knocked. Anyway, lightly more a tap than a bang. 3 seconds later, I heard 2 soft taps back. They were deliberate, spaced the same as mine. For a moment, I thought maybe a coworker of the clerk was inside having a smoke break, but the hairs on my forearms prickled. Itchried the knob again solid. He walked to the counter. Somebody's in there. I zed through the slot. The shook his head ons. No key told you pipes. Just started tapping. He leaned closer, voice lone. Now maybe the vent is rattling. Wind kicks up this time of night. The plate glass window behind him showed the desert still as a photograph. Mistomact wisted I should have left, but leaving meant ignoring whatever was behind that door. I thought about my sister back in Santa Fe. How she'd stopped on a road trip once and called to say a stranger in a truck made her uncomfortable. You don't walk away from that feeling. You backed out, sat in the van, and dialed 911. State police dispatcher asked for the address. I had to read the mile marker, then ask what was wrong. I think someone's locked in a bathroom at the Texacoon Route 392. The clerk won't open it. He expected a sigh on the other end, but she said troopers were already patrolling. A few exits ceased. They'd swing by. The wait stretched into 15 minutes. The pickup at the pump never moved. The clerk stayed behind his glass, jotting something in a ledger. Me stomach cramped from the coffee yet. The urge towards a bathroom had vanished, replaced by something colder. You imagined a kidnapped kid or runaway, maybe someone overdosing. You picture the worst when silence fills a room. Blue lights finally washed over the lot. 2 New Mexico State Police cruisers rolled in. The clerk stepped outside his booth. Before they even reached the door, hands up like he'd practiced through my windshield. Is all a brief conversation, too civil, too quick. Then the officers headed to the hallway. The clerk walked behind them, keys jangling. Evanho he'd sworn none existed. I got out and hung back near the ice chest. Stone trooper knocked. Nothing. He tilted his head, listening, then motioned for the keys. The clerk hesitated, tugged at the ring, tried 3 or 4 each time. He shook his head like the lock set was unfamiliar. His hands trembled. The taller trooper signed his partner, who stepped aside, and radio it. In the first one, drew a collapsible baton, jammed it between no band. Jam and put his shoulder to the metal thin door. Olden. I was gave on these con hit. Something metallic clattered inside. The smell hit next, not rot, thank God, but stales wet and what might have been ammonia. The trooper slidin' and barked for medics, said forward before they blocked the view. She lay on her side near the mops and cankles, chained with abacycle lock, wrists bound duct tape across her mouth. Stringy brown hair stuck to her cheeks. Sharius twitched toward the sudden light, but couldn't focus. It froze. You think you'll jump in be the hero. Instead you stand there, 1 foot rooted, as if your brain refused to accept the scene. These con trooper herded me out. Weren't far behind. They lifted her onto a backboard. I've already running. I caught their name from the medic's radio. Laura Ma Artinez, 29. 2 weeks earlier, a woman disappeared after a night shift. A tear sword outside town. Last seen driving a silver Corolla, found abandoned near I-25. Same name photo that had stared from every conveniences store bulletin boards. Since the clerk, whose name tag Zed Devon, was cuffed against the cooler door, he kept repeating, "I was just watching her for somebody, that's all." He sounded more annoyed than scared when the shorter trooper closed the cruiser door on him. Devin glanced at me through the glass, and for half a second his face shifted into something that wasn't worry or regret. It was resentment, like a man losing a poker game because someone spotted the ace up his sleeve. Troopers took my statement beside the pumps. I told them exactly what I'd heard and how Devin had insisted nobody was back there. The older officer, Sergeant Juarez, nodded and scribbled, then said I'd probably saved Laura's life. Dehydration and infection would have finished her in another day or two, as wallowed hard stared at the cold stars and felt smaller than ever. Have an investigator asked to search my van, a formality. He said he wasn't offended after the adrenaline faded as at behind the wheel, hands shaking so badly. I dropped my keys twice. The place looked ordinary again, same flicker in the signs, aim dessert quiety. At every corner felt contaminated, a Cyfevel soaked into the cinder block, skipped Amarillo. Radioed my dispatcher and drove straight back to Albuquerque. With the radio off, dawn crept over the Sandia Mountains, painting them pink, and traffic on I-40 thickened with commuters who had no idea what the night had been for. For Laura, she survived. Followed the story in the Albuquerque Journal. Fractured wrist, malnourished, but alive. She told detectives Devin had picked her up in Santa Fe after she'd argued with a boyfriend outside a bar. He'd offered a ride, drugged her soda, and kept her locked up while friends figured out how to sell her car. An ID. Police linked him to two other missing person cases stretching back a year. Both women still unaccounted for. Some nights when I'm halfway between Gallup and Grants and the highway is black except for my headlights, I replay her 2 taps on that hollow door. You wonder if she chose that exact rhythm, more if it was the only sound her cuffed hands could manage. And I wonder how many drivers used that station over the weeks she was strapped there. How many heard nothing, how many walked away? Because the clerk said pipes don't stop at remote stations anymore, unless I see a bathroom key hanging on a hubcap-shaped fob behind the counter. Old trucker superstition, that means the clerk hands it over without question when friends ask why I care so much about a locked door. I tell them about March 3rd, 2024. I tell them there's nothing supernatural on the highway. At night, just people, and sometimes that's worse. Before we dive into the next story, if you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. I never thought a quiet stretch of desert highway could keep me up at night. But the summer of 2024 proved me wrong. Every graveyard shift, I pulled at the old Sanat Coon, US 285112, south of Vaughn, New Mexico. Made the dark feel a little heavier. He worked alone, tucked inside a prefab kiosk that rattled whenever the prairie wind hit the metal roof. My hours ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, and on most shifts, is all fewer than 20 customers. Coyotes yipped beyond the sodium lights. Moths smacked the windows and the radio stations faded to static long before midnight. The routine should have been dull, but something about the desert after dark always made me feel as if the world were holding its breath. On Monday, August 12th, the monotony cracked. I remember looking at the clock on the register because the late night news had just finished listing the next day's heat advisories. It was 2:40 a.m. Remember when a dull green Ford Taurus rolled off the highway, drifted past each of the 2 fuel islands, and glided back onto the asphalt without stopping. The car's headlights were dim, its right rear hubcap missing, and a long dent on the passenger side. His rugged off as a lost traveler, and went back to wiping down the coffee station. But event then the image gnawed at me. There had been no hesitation, not a puff the brakes, as thought the driver never intended to buy gas. At all, the Taurus returned the very next night. At the exact same time, it traced the same lazy circle through the lot, hires whispering on packed dust, and faded into the dark the third night. It ried to wave, hoping the driver might roll down a window and ask for directions, but the car only passed close enough for the high beams to shiver my chest before lumbering away. I caught a ghostly reflection in the side window, yet saw a vase just as mirror of dashboard glare that unsettled memor than the visit itself. By Thursday, I was waiting for it. He leaned against the counter, pen poised over the shift ledger, ready to record anything that looked like a pattern, because patterns brought a little comfort out. I read 2:40 on the dot. The headlights reappeared, curved across the bank of pumps, and vanished. He wrote down the date, the hour, and a short description. Green Taurus circled lot, but the act offered no relief. I showed the note to Manny, the morning clerk, when he arrived to relieve. Mihalaft said maybe a board deputy liked practicing laps and poured himself a coffee. County deputies, I reminded him, drove white Broncos, not rusty early 90s sedans. But Manny just shrugged. The next week unfolded like a scratched record. Whenever the clock neared 200 forward, my nerves tightened, and every single night, except Sunday, the Taurus appeared one night, its load. Next top pump 4 before continuing its loop another night. The headlights flickered as if the electrical system was on its last legs. Curiosity overpowered good sense. Tuesday, August 20th. I walked out the kiosk door and jogged toward the Sistani, raised my handing reading. Whoever sat behind the wheel never looked my way. The car floated past the engine, idling low and smooth, then picked up speed and slid onto the highway in the glow of the taillights. In August, the license plate light was dead, which explained why I still hadn't been able to catch the numbers. Desert storms announced themselves with ozone and a distant grumble. On September 3rd, a band of thunderheads rolled up from the south, dragging a curtain of dry lightning that flashed violet over the prairie around 2:30. The static grew loud enough to crackle through the metal framing of the kiosk, and for the first time all night, I welcomed the distraction. Then 2:40 arrived like clockwork. The Taurus emerged from the darkness. Only this time it braked beside Pump 4 and settled their engine, burbling unevenly. 5 minutes ticked by. Warm drops of rain began to pock the concrete. 10 minutes past the car's still idled windows, opaque wipers scraping across a windshield in redustig. Grabbed my flashlight, stepped into the muggy air, and walked toward it. My throat dried with each step. As I reached the driver's side mirror, the door latch clicked open, and the panel eased outward. The dome light failed. The seat in front of me sagged under its own weight, empty except for shredded gray upholstery. There were Noki shanging from the ignition. Thought the engine continued to run. My flashlight's beam skimmed across the steering wheel just in time to catch the speedometer needle jump from to 20 and drop again. Every hair on my arms stood up. A backed away heart hammering. The doors lammed shut, as if an irritated driver had yanked at the stand's headlights, flared brighter than they had all night, and the wheel twitched a quarter. Turned. The Taurus rolled forward, curved through the exit lane, and disappeared onto the highway. Gathering speed without anyone inside, I locked the kiosk door and stared through the security glass until the taillights blipped out. When Manny arrived at dawn, he found me hunched over the DVR consoler, replaying the camera feed even on the grain. Recording. The cabin looked as empty as it had in person at 2:52. The driver's door opened, stayed ajar for 30 seconds, then shut. The car idled another half minute before pulling away on its own. Manny whistled and told me it should email the clip to his cousin who loved urban legend podcasts. But what I really wanted was area sonable explanation. As Ave the footage to a flash drive, called the non-emergency number for Torrance County, and waited outside with a stale cinnamon roll while 2 deputies took their time responding. The deputies were polite, thought they spent more minutes teasing me about haunted cars than taking notes on suggested abandoned vehicle report. The other wondered if someone had rigged our remote control system to scare commuters, remote control or not. I couldn't imagine why anyone would waste gas pranking a forgotten station on a dead highway. They left without promising much more than a mention in the next morning's dispatch mails. Leapless afternoons became my new routine. I would lie on my coat in the studio apartment behind the grocery, and Vaughn replay the footage on my phone and pause on the frame where the Taurus crossed under the canopy. Its hood looked empty, but the shadows inside the windshield felt dense east, though something gathered in those shadows, unable to let it drop. I called a friend who worked at the Motor Vehicle Division office in Santa Fe, texted her the plate, finally captured New Mexico 4-3 WL10, asked if she could check it. He called back after closing time and told me the car belonged to a woman named Marianne Hull from Roswell. Her registration had expired in March 2020. The same month, the vehicle was totaled in a rollover outside Santa Rosa. The salvage company had written it off and hauled day for crushing in December of that year. The realization that a wrecked scrapped car was paying nightly visits to my pumps made my skin crawl. Drove to Santa Rosa on my next day off and met a salvage yard employee named Robbie, who showed me an intake photograph. The same Ford Taurus roof flattened windshield starred like a spider web. He said the car was crushed and cut apart years ago when I played him my security clip on a dusty office computer. He pushed back his chairs of acids, squeaked against the concrete. He mumbled something about stolen plates, but even he couldn't explain how a license registered to a demolished vehicle wound up hundreds of miles away in working order. September bled into October. The desert cooled at night, the sky sharpening into a field of brittle stars. Every graveyard shift still carried that inevitability, the hush right. Before 2:40, the Taurus never missed its appointment. Some nights it stopped for only a breath, other nights it idled 4 minutes, as if savoring the tension. He wanted proof that would satisfy my own doubts soon. October 2nd, I printed a sheet of paper that read pump out of order and taped it to Crefor's busted LCD display. 2 nights later, the Taurus rolled up to the same pump anyway. Headlights pointed directly at the signatory there until the clock jumped to 250, then floated away. That was the night I decided I couldn't do this until Christmas. Like the regional manager hoped is at my last day for Halloween, figuring the timing would give the story added, ending for anyone who might one day tell it around about on October 12th. The brief power blink shut down every bulb in the station for 10 seconds. When the light snapped back, these Dan sat a foot from the kiosk door driver's side, facing me, door ajar, seatbelt hanging outward like a discarded arm, stayed locked inside until dawn. At that point, I was less afraid of ridicule than of being alone in the desert with a machine that moved without a soul. I begged the company to swap someone into my sloat Turley, but nobody else wanted the graveyard shifts. Oh, Halloween remained my last night. The air turned brittle on October 31st. Dusk, a ragged fog bank rose from the prairie, rolling low across the scrub until the station's sodium lamps glowed a Chalocin white murk. Not many trick-or-treaters ventured this far, and by midnight, the highway resembled a river of ink around one. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, just to hear something other than my own breathing. Coyotes yipped off to the west, then fell silent. Fog muffled the sound of my boots on gravel. When I glanced back at the kiosk, the building seemed to float alone in the haze, detached from the earth. At 1:30, the power died completely. The bulbs hissed and winked out. The cooler motors clicked to stillness. Only the emergency battery kept the cameras rolling, and a single panel light in the DVR pulled out my flashlight, its beam dull in the thick fog, and tried the switch for the canopy lights. Nothing. A dry gust fluttered the pump out of orders. Signa counted down the minutes. 2:39 arrived, then 2:40. Beyond the edge of the lot, something bright pushed through the white veil headlights, melted out of the fog glow and yellow, gliding toward pump 4. The Taurus coasted in without a whisper of gravel. Engine off, windows rolled up. It came to rest exactly where the out-of-order pump waited. The nozzle unhooked itself, dropped to the pavement, and swung lazily as if guided by a careful hand. The driver's door opened. A long exhale of hot air rolled from the car's interiors, melling of dust and radiator fluid. I crouched behind the counter, squeezing the dead flashlight until my knuckles hurt. From somewhere inside the kiosk, a footstep pressed against Vinil's low, deliberate heels, sliding forward to a planting candy bars, rattled on their rack. Another steps. Something brushed the lottery display. I held my breaths of earsly my ribs. Like the air tasted of metal, shavings the stepsha. LT behind the counter, 2 knuckles tapped the laminate above me. Take knock exactly more, like a patient reminder that I had been noticed. Depressed my forehead to my knees and didn't look up until a gray line of dawn broke the eastern sky. When I finally stood, every shelf sat exactly as I had left it. The lock on the door remained thrown, yet my shift log lay open on the counter. Turned to the first day I had recorded the cart. That single sentence about the Taurus circling the lot, a greasy black thumb print larger than any I could make, smeared the margin beside the note. Empty. Ed my locker faster than it takes store count. By 8, I was on a northbound bus to Albuquerque, leaving my last check uncollected. Since then, I have moved twice. The flash drive with the footage is buried beneath winter socks in a drawer I rarely open, though sometimes at 2:40 a.m. Manharmy body now recognizes with unwanted precision. He watched the file again. The camera catches a state said in entering an empty loading at a pump and pulling away without a driver. There is no glitch where the car dissolves. It simply rolls onward, vanishing beyond the edge of the camera's field. The way a thought slips out of reach when you wake. Local news stations keep running short segments about ghost cars, and the interstate state trooper's dash cam clip from early December showed what looked like the same Taurus drifting across lanes near Klein's Corners. Patrol cruisers witched on its lights, but by the time it crested the next hill, both the car and its heat signature were gone. The trooper told reporters he had assumed the driver bailed into the brush, yet not racks were found in the dust on either side of the road. I like to think state lines matter, but 3 nights ago I was topping off my pip at a Lowe's outside Dalhart, Texas. My phone screen read 2:38 a.m. A pair of dim headlights flickered way down US 54, weaving gently as if the steering wheel needed constant correction. I left $20 worth of gas in the tank, jumped into the cab and drove home on a near-empty tank, refusing to glance at the mirror the entire 30 miles now. Every night I wake at 2:40 without fail. The rest of the world lies silent, and in that silence I often heard the faint rumble of an old engine idling at a distance, neither fair none nor near enough to tell myself the sound is only in my head, that the Taurus stayed behind in New Mexico, circling a lot. That means nothing to me anymore, but when the hour arrived, my heart beat the way it did behind that counter, and I remember those footsteps, that patient tap, and the grease-black mark on paper that carried my own handwriting. It reminds me that the road never ends in the desert. It just keeps stretching into darkness, waiting for someone like me to sit alone at a forgotten station and listen for an engine a human hand can still use to think the worst thing that could happen on a late-night road trip was a blown tire or a caffeine crash. That belief changed on a humid Friday in July 2023, somewhere between Kansas City and Topeka, when a 10-minute gas stop turned into a memory. I still pick apart every time the clock slides past midnight. My wife Laura and I had spent the day loading our rental van with her grandmother's furniture in Overland Park. The plan was simple: drive through the night to Denver, before the weekend traffic crash at her brother's apartment, and unload the next morning. By the time we merged onto I-7 westbound, the sun was long gone, and a bank of thunderheads loomed over the Flint Hills. Like bruises, Lara dozed be. Ahan McNeese pulled to her chest earbuds and classic rock whispered from the dash speaker's tulo to cover the low drone of highway seams just after 11:45. Memphifuelite chime, I remembered a Phillips 66 in a town called Paxacoon of those tinny exits with a single street lamp, and Dasilo that passes for a skyline. The store stayed open 24 hours and it needed coffee as much as the needed gas 2 minutes later. The Ayrton black sign rose out of the dark, blinking against low clouds. I rolled beneath the fluorescent canopy, parked at pump 6 and killed the engine. The concrete smelled of spilled diesel and wet dust. Lara mooted. Restroom. I pointed to the convenience's store door, kissed her knuckles and stepped outside. A solitary said, dance a toposit meet pump 3. A gray Nissan Altima with South Dakota plates strunk plastered with road grime. Its driver stood facing the pump, shoulder hunched, hoodie pulled up. Event thought the air felt like bathwater. He was the only other customer. The clerk inside leaned on the counter, scrolling her phone. I unscrewed the gas cap, slid my card, and selected regular as the pump clicked to life. I heard it 3 dull thuds like knuckles on a hollow door. They came from the direction of the ultimate. The hoodie man paused, unmoving, then reached for the nozzle. Another set of thuds followed, rapid, urgent. He glanced over his back, remained to me, but his head turned just enough that I caught this profile: pale skin, razor-sharp cheekbones, his eyes reflecting the canopy light like glass. He stared at me without blinking. Everything. Okay, tried to sound casual. The words felt thin. Head didn't answer here. Placed the nozzle without pumping a drop, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door. The knocking stopped. These Dan reversed with a squeal, headlights sweeping across my knees, and shot toward the exit. I memorized the last 2. Letters on the plate, CZ. Heartbeat later. The taillights vanished onto County Road K92, swallowed by darkness. For a moment the world was silent, except for the gurgle of gas rushing into my tank. Began to fall, warm spars drops that darkened the concrete, and polka dots. Yanked the nozzle. Early paid for 22 gallons and hurried inside. The clerk, a college kid in a Washburn University hoodie, raised an eyebrow while I fumbled for words. Guy in the Altima. I said, voice shaking. Something was banging in his trunk, like knocking. She blinked, glanced past me at the empty bays, and reached for the store phone. There's a sheriff's substation 1 exit west, she said. I'll call. She dialed before I could say more and gave dispatch the fragment of the plate, the direction in my account. When she handed me the receiver, the operator took my statement, promised a deputy would canvass the area, and asked that I reachable back in the van. Lara gripped her coffee like it might spill if she breathed. Wrong rain thickened, drumming the windshield. I merged onto I-7, minding the stare, the sudden silence, the thuds. We drove 20 miles in uneasy quiet until blue lights filled the rear view. Exhaled, guessing a deputy had found the Ultima. But the cruiser sped past, Seren silent, disappearing into the black ahead at 12:32 a.m. My phone rang with an unfamiliar Kansas number. I put it on speaker. Mr. Henley, Deputy Armstrong, Waubonsee County. You reported suspicious activity at Paxacoy. I said, well-located and abandoned Nissan Altima off Moorhead Road, about 7 mi from the station keys. Still in the ignition. Now driver. Lara covered her mouth. The deputy continued. We noticed unusual damage inside the trunk. We'd like you to meet us on scene for a formal statement. While the details are fresh, Rain Hiss said, louder, wiper slapping. Wanted to refuse to keep driving until Denver. But Armstrong's tone tight, urgent, made saying no feel wrong. Text meth location. I said. The pin dropped onto my map. North. Over a place called Keena turned onto a 2-lane road that tunneled through oaks. The storm had robbed event the horizon of light, and the high beams carved only 30 yards of visibility. Lara muttered that this felt stupid, but curiosity and duty tugged us onward. 10 minutes later, strobing lights bounced through the trees. 2 cruisers and an ambulance. It led in mud near a trailhead sign that read Slow Creek Wildlife Area. A deputy in a rain slicker flagged us down his patch. Red Armstrong held us beneath yellow tape toward a dirt spur where the Ultima crouch. Ed, like a wounded animal, strunk, gaped under floodlights. As Mel Dyer, the moment West stepped closer, dry, metallic, unmistakable. The interior sunshade had been ripped down. Foam spilling like guts, long scratch marks raked the paint on the underside of the lid, some downward, some sideways, deep enough to expose bare steel clumps of fingernails broken at the quick lay on the stained carpet. A crimson smear trailed from the latch to the weather stripping. His wallowed bile. Armstrong turned his flashlight on the scratches fresh. Whoever was in there fought like heller. Water beaded on Lara's hair and ran down her neck. He recounted the gas station encounter twice. While another deputy recorded, they asked if I'd noticed anyone else in these. Dan heard voices or smelled anything. I'd told them. No, just the knocking and that stare. I added the fragment of the plate and the South Dakota tag. Armstrong's jaw tightened. Stolen yesterday in Sioux Falls. He said the owner's safe-at-home crime scene texts finished photographing the trunk. One muttered, "Jesus," and lowered the lid with a dull thunk. They hadn't found anyone alive or dead in the woods. Trackers were due at first light. Armstrong released us at 2:10. Montherain had tapered to miss the asked us to stop at the sheriff's office in Almathene next afternoon for written affidavit. We promised and left Lara Creed silently in the passenger seat. It drove 55 fists. Atching around the wheel, we traded drivers near Salina. Dawn bled pink behind ragged clouds. Neither of us spoke until radio news at 7 announced an Amber Alert for a missing Topeka teenager. Her name was Jessica Keller, 16, brown hair, 5'4". The report noted chip blue nail polish on her right hand. It hawed of the broken nails scattered across the Altima's carpet and pulled onto the shoulder to keep from vomiting. Denver blurred by in a hazy of exhaustion and dread. We unloaded furniture, like robots nodding through small talk with Laura's brother. Every slam of a car door in the apartment complex lot made you flinch. Sunday morning, Deputy Armstrong called again. Search team had found footprints from the Ultima leading deeper into Slow Creek, but the rain erased them after a 4-mile, no suspect, no victim. The car went to the state lab for forensics. The case hit regional headlines under variations of mysterious abandoned car shows signs of struggles. Social media boiled with the Ori's cartel hit. Trafficking ring runaway prank. But it stayed off my phone. A week later, returned the rental van. Night came early, and in bed, I replayed the star behind the pump. The hoodie masked the man's features, but I remembered eyes that didn't blink, cold and curious like someone studying an insect. Each knock seemed to echo in my skull, demanding how I hadn't given mid-September. Brought a call from Detective Her Prince inside the Ultima match. Aparola from Oklahoma named Daniel Phelps, history of assault and kidnapping. He hadn't reported to his halfway house supervisor since June. Detectives traced him to pawn shop sales in Wichita 3 days before we saw the car. Still no sign of him. Or the girl October turned the cottonwoods gold along the Missouri River. Lara began sleeping again. It pretended to every soothed in my phone buzzed with her number asking me. Or described Phelps's stance, his stare, whether he'll impede or word jewelry. Memory is a traitor. Each retelling felt thinner on Halloween morning. Hunters found a shallow grave 2 miles from where the Ultima had sat inside. Was Jessica Keller wrapped in a motel shower curtain, hands bound with tape. The coroner estimated she died the night we heard the knocking. Cause of death, asphyxiation. The story led every Kansas broadcast for days. They showed her school photo beside a grainy still of the hooded man at the gas stations. Napped seconds before he noticed me looking. It quit my job. That December night, driving maid's wet pool in my palms. Whenever we visited family, wet traveled at noon, yet insomnia clung to me around midnight. I'd wander the apartment lights off, listening to traffic whisper 6 stories below. Sometimes I'd swear a faint tapping drifted up from the street. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more, always 3. I'd grip the windows, ill until sunrise. Deputy Arn kept in touch through spring 2024. Phelps was spotted in Montana, then Oregon, Och tip colder than the last. The FBI believes he haunts truck stop spraying on. Runaways, the knocks we heard, were Jessica's final plea. Replayed the what-ifs until the tape snaps. What if I'd pounded on the trunk, forced him to intervene? The clerk might have hit the panic button, maybe Jessica would be alive. But then I picture Phelps' star, the calm way he drove off, face if any interruption was merely a speed bump, and I wonder if he had a gun, if he would have killed me too. This July will mark 2 years. Laura and I live in Fort Collins, now closer to mountains than highway. She teaches pottery. I work days at a hardware store, most evenings send with wine. A movie and the illusion of normal life. Eat at 11:45 p. I always feel the urge to look outside and scan license plates under the street lamp. Some nights, a dusty sedanidless at the curb trunk, facing away, exhaust like a question. I tell myself it's a neighbor, a delivery driver, a coincidence. Then the silence blooms thick, accusing, and in that hush is where I hear Threek knock steady and pleading, followed by the slam of a trunk lid that will echo in my head for the rest of my life.